Hi, my name is Dan, and um, I've kind of been asked to write a book about training for bilingual schools, and I'm definitely not the best writer. I tend to be more of a when I write, I'm more of a just the facts kind of guy, and not very engaging. So, as part of this process, I thought I would make some make some basically podcasts about about the chapters in the book to organize my thoughts. A lot of times when I'm chatting, I have a lot better involvement, like get some anecdotes going or something, which doesn't happen in my writing almost ever. So, um, anyway, that's the point of this. Um, I've been doing language acquisition for about 30 years and language teacher management training for almost 20 and bilingual education for about 10. So, today we're going to talk about the foundations of good bilingual education, and you can kind of see uh, on the left side, I guess it's right side over here. We're going to be mostly talking about second language acquisition, comprehensible input, and CPD, zone proximal development. Uh, so let's go ahead and get started because I'm not a kind of guy who like just doesn't get started. So you're going to hear some whooshing as I switch over on my desktop between some stuff. So, uh, first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at a blog from Dr. Olenka Bilash, and it's about Krashen's uh, uh, comprehensible input theory, which is kind of the basis of everything we need to do in a bilingual school. So, um, I taught language for quite a few years, and then I taught math in the U.S. and and then when I moved to bilingual schools, it became pretty obvious to me that teaching straight subjects doesn't work very well for students because most of our students are primarily language learners, and they need to both get on level content and the English language. So I had to pull in a lot of the kind of fundamental theories that I use when teaching English as a second language for a few years. And Crashing is kind of the basis of that. I've been a Crashing acolyte for 20 years, 25 years or so, um, before I was teaching when I was still a linguist for the U.S. government. So um, there are a bunch of hypotheses that revolve around this. So instead of making slides, I found some blog posts that kind of relate to this. So the foundation is the acquisition learning hypothesis over here, and basically, when I studied language in high school, I studied Chinese my last 2 years of high school. Um, I did basically what everybody does in high school, which is have some vocabulary lists, and we have some conversations to model. Maybe we have some short readings to do, and yeah, I was amazing. I finished high school, and I was the number one person in my Chinese class. So as a result of that, I got the opportunity. It's a long time ago to go to Beijing to study uh, to study abroad for about 2 months in Beijing. Which back then, 1986, it was Deng Xiaoping's era, and the open door was just opening, and China had been closed under Mao for forever. So it was kind of a big opportunity for me. I was really excited and really proud of the fact that I did really well in Chinese class, and I got there, and the very first day I showed up at the dormitory, and then I went down to the cafeteria. Didn't look like any cafeteria I'd ever seen before. A bunch of round tables, and I didn't know where to sit, and there was no place to get any food, so I kind of sat down by myself because I didn't know anybody. I went alone. About 10 minutes later, some worker from the cafeteria came out, from the back and asked me a question in Chinese, and I responded in Chinese. Can you say that a little bit more slowly, please? And so she repeated the question. It's pretty obviously a question. 你要吃饭吗? So I did, what any good student would do. I said, can you say that again a little bit more slowly? And we went back and forth like this for a good five minutes maybe, until she ended up with 你要吃饭吗? Do you want to eat? And there's no way I could not understand that, even if I didn't understand a word of Chinese, which apparently I didn't. So despite the fact that I finished first in my class and got chosen for this this great opportunity to go to China, I couldn't communicate at all. And this kind of highlights what happens in a language, most language learning classrooms is that we're learning language. We're basically learning language the same way we learn history. And unfortunately for us students, the brain is not set up that way. Language is an integral part of our brain. We have special language processing areas in our brain just to deal with it. So if we're treating language the same as history, we're making a big mistake. This is where Kreischen gets into the difference between language learning and language acquisition. So, when you were young, if you're monolingual basically, or you're not fluent in a second language, this is something to relate to. You just learn the language that you're immersed in, and it takes a long time. It takes years, right? I mean, you don't say anything for the first year, maybe the first almost 2 years, and then you really can't say anything of note for 4 or 5 years. So, but how does that happen? That happens by you just listening and watching, and people give you something and then tell you what it is, and then you want that, so you have to try to remember what that is. And this is all like a natural process going on in your brain. And a corollary to Kreischen's theory is the critical hypothesis theory, which says that when we get a little bit older, this doesn't happen. But it's hotly debated whether that's true or not, and whether we can't learn that way, or we're just too impatient when we're 15 years old to sit around and have people speak baby talk to us for 3 years before we can actually communicate. Most people don't have that kind of patience. So in any case, we have a choice between either learning the language and learning a bunch of vocabulary, and then running some grammar forms, and basically running real-time translation through a bunch of layers in our head, get a thought in our first language, for probably everybody here is going to be English, and then figure out what those words would be, and then what you want to say, and how to put them in the right order, and then that stuff comes out either written or spoken. And in the same way, when we're listening or reading is a little bit easier because you've got lots of time to go back and check things that you did. But listening, it's like a river, and it just flows past, and you miss that, there's no way you're going to grab that water and get it back. So we want to make this process for our students of understanding what's the language that's being presented, the language that's being presented to them. We want to make that as easy for them as possible, and in order to do that, we need to make sure that they're acquiring language and not learning language as much as possible. And I have a pretty standard metaphor that I use for this. Maybe it's an analogy. We'll say analogy. if you play any computer games, and you have ever played any computer games on a computer that's, you know, not tablet or your mobile phone, um, there's a couple of different ways to play. You know, you can have a various various what am I trying to say here? Screen size, screen resolution. There you go. That's what. Different screen resolutions, and different screen resolutions, uh, you're going to get different frame rates of playback. Um, and if you've ever played on a computer that you built yourself, maybe it's like 1% of the people here. This is a really a really relevant analogy for you. Um, it's uh, you might have mis configured your graphics driver, in which case you're running completely on CPU. And if you're doing software rendering for your game, everything's just going like this, like it's like picture after picture, one a second, or one every 2 seconds, and, and the game's unplayable. Um, and that's kind of how I look at acquisition versus learning. So learning is like doing everything in your CPU. It's like using your normal brain to do all the stuff that needs to be done for a language. But we like our graphics card, uh, graphics driver. We have a special part of our brain that's devoted to language, and we can offload that computing off onto that language center. And if we do that, then everything becomes really smooth, really easy, and a lot more fun. You know, language learning is not fun for almost anybody, really, honestly, because it's just so much work and it's so difficult. But language acquisition, I'm not going to say it's fun for everybody, but it's fun and interesting for a lot more, a lot bigger percentage of people. So, you know, basically what we need to do in the classroom is we need to figure out how to present language in such a way that our students can acquire that language instead of learn that language. Um, and in order to do that, a lot of the basic principle is, you know, there needs to be a lot of their the target language, the language that we want to learn. Um, and we have to do special things with that target language to make it more uh, acquirable. We haven't gotten to comprehensible input, so I want to make it more comprehensible. Um, so the second thing that's talked about here is the monitor hypothesis, and monitor is a lot more really about production than reception, about producing language than understanding language. But our monitor, I don't really think this is about second language learning at all. This is more like a mental model, like a personality type of the person. So um, our monitor is kind of like, I like to call it an editor instead of a monitor. So, you know, imagine that you've got a writer or a newspaper or a blog, and they're going to they write a piece and then they send it off to the editor to be copied. You know, there are different kinds of editors, and you know, from ones that redline everything to ones that rubber stamp. And monitor is kind of the same way. In our brain, we're kind of parsing through and checking the writing or the speech that comes out uh, for accuracy. Is that really what we meant to say? You know, and some people do that really well and speak clearly and coherently at a nice pace, and those are, you know, those are that's where you need to be. But there's a lot of us, me included, who are not in there. So I'm going to bring up a graphic from the monitor hypothesis and this is from Krashen's second language acquisition paper. Uh, you know, this optimal here in the table, you know, there's less hesitation, and they still use conscious rules, but not overly much. just enough to make sure that that things are going generally well, said generally what you need. But there are people like me who generally are hesitant speakers, tend to think a lot more about what we say before it comes out of our mouth, or before what we're going to write before we write. Um, and that makes communication more difficult because we're it's it's not that I'm it's not about self-confidence. It's not that I don't have any self-confidence. I'm just it's a personality type. So I'd like to make sure that what I say is correct. And so I have these hesitations in the middle of my sentences and stuff like that. And that happens in both first language and second language. And a lot of times, in my experience, looking at kids, they speak the same way in both in their first language in L1 and in target language too. And then there are the underusers, which people who just have just no filter, and whatever they think just comes out without any filter at all, and that can one socially that can be a problem, right? But number two is as far as language use, they're not thinking about grammar at all, and not necessarily grammar rules, but does that really match what I meant to say? That's not something that really clicks for them, so communication for them becomes hard because they're inaccurate a lot of the time. They use words inaccurately, whether L1 or L2, whether first language or target language, and uh, and then they mix up the order of their sentences, because they change their mind in the middle of the sentence, and then they just finish with whatever. So, that's those are basically the three kinds of monitor users, and of course it's a scale. It's not binary. It's not trinary. There's not just three categories. It's a scale. Um, and who is an appropriate user is maybe you're a heavy monitor user and you think that's the appropriate thing. So there is some opinion to this, but there is a nice sweet spot where somebody's able to check their language, as they produce it, and still have a fair amount of fluency, which honestly I think I fail at. Our third hypothesis up here under Krashen's second language acquisition theories is the natural order hypothesis, and it says that kind of like babies, will get language in the same way. You find that babies throughout the world tend to speak the same few words first, and acquire certain kinds of language first, and then get different kinds of language later. And so this hypothesis basically says that pretty much no matter what the first language is and what the culture is, the first things that get said are basically the same, and they go pretty much in the same order. Development goes pretty much the same way, and really, this is kind of I want to say common sense, because kindergarten teachers, preschool teachers know that you start teaching things to kids in the here and now, right here, right around them. You don't start teaching them about countries far away. You start teaching them about things in their neighborhood. If you're going to do some kind of social studies discussion, and this is the same kind of way. The things that you interact with daily those are the things that you're going to learn to discuss, to understand first. So you're gonna learn about, especially things like, it's kind of a common okay, so if we're going to teach English, and you are going to construct an English curriculum, teaching curriculum, starting off from zero, you might be tempted to start with present simple, I eat, I go, something like that. just because the form is a lot simpler. The mechanics are so much easier. But our brain doesn't really work like that. Our brain works on semantic meaning. So it doesn't much care that the form is simpler. It's much easier to start with the here and now and things that you interact with every day, which is one of the reasons why we talk a lot about classroom, objects and such in early language. Excuse me, early language classes. But it's much easier to get the form of like commands or talk about present continuous, uh, present progressive if you're UK, I think, and what am I doing now? What are you doing now? It's a lot easier to start there because that's the here and now. So natural order hypothesis kind of works that way from concrete to abstract, basically. So next we have input hypothesis, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a second. But input hypothesis says that we need to be working with comprehensible. So you need to have as much exposure to the target language as possible if you're a student, but that language needs to be comprehensible to you. And you'll see this I+1 term bandied about. But so at whatever level you're at level I. We want to bump it up just a bit and put you at level I+1, feed you stuff at that. And this is all very hand wavy because what is +1 and what is I and what are levels and and when we get down right directly under here to the effective filter, one means nothing here because one can be a very wide band for some people in some circumstances and a very narrow band for different people or even the same people in very different circumstances. But input hypothesis basically says we need to give you a little bit more than you understand right now. And I have something from SpanishPlans.org here. So let me go ahead and see if I can find this. I'm not exactly sharing my screen here, so there we are. So I really like this blog post because this is pretty much exactly the analogy that I use for when I'm training teachers. Charlie Brown's getting a little bit old at this point. I think maybe not that many people know. But back when I started, it was a really good, really useful metaphor. You never hear what the teacher's saying. You just hear whoa, 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 whoa. And really, when we're studying a foreign language, if you've been in an immersion ever, that's what it sounds like. It's just a bunch of nonsense. And the reason is, if you're at this level I, you can whatever +1 is, again very handy, whatever that is, you can kind of figure that stuff out through context. And anything above that level suddenly becomes white noise. And our brain is an amazingly effective filter, which is different than the effective filter, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it is an effective filter that it just filters out everything. I mean, there's no way. It's not that. And if you're a teacher, you need to understand your students that if they're not understanding what you're saying, that's probably not that they're not trying hard enough. I mean, it's not that you can just say, "Oh, I need to work harder. I need to, I need to make more effort to hit that stuff." Maybe if there's a little bit give, you're like 10% above that, but that one maybe. But if you're up here, there's nothing you can do as a student that will help you understand that. It's just impossible. And uh, anyway, so uh, so we want to try to keep as much of that language off the uh, area as we can, because no growth happens there, and it is a complete waste of classroom time. And if you are a subject teacher, that's terrible, because your students are not developing their language, and they're not getting the content that you are hired to teach them, because they can't understand it. So uh, uh, this comes down to a point of how much you're in the target language, which for almost everybody here is going to be English. So how much English you speak in class, and there is there is a mistaken notion that complete 100% English in the classroom is desirable. I mean, if you can keep everything comprehensible, then yes, do it. And um, you want to maximize the amount of time in the target language in English for your students. But in the same sense, we'll talk in a little bit. One of the ways to make language a little bit more comprehensible is if you have just random word coming in, you can especially for higher level stuff. In lower level stuff, you can use a picture or something like that. But for higher level stuff, you can just whip out a quick translation for that word, and then move on. And kids will be able to follow. So, uh, point number 4 is you don't acquire language through output. Um, Comprehensible input and comprehensible output are two different theories, but you need to have that language model in your brain before you can ever really produce meaningful stuff. And so uh, things that I always whack my teachers over the head with are receptive skills before productive skills, comprehension before production. Make sure your kids understand what's being done before they start to produce language. Make sure you spend a good amount of time giving them time to get that comprehensible input done before you start requiring output. So I think we can run back to Dr. Bilash here and take a look at the effective filter hypothesis. The effective filter hypothesis basically is about this plus one level, and various factors can either make it wider or narrower. They can open up or close off that filter. And you can see at the bottom here: anxiety, self-confidence, motivation, and stress. So you may think that, hey, that means I want to have a fun classroom, and you do kind of want to have a fun classroom, but fun is not the primary goal. Get your students confident. Get your students feel like they understand what's going on in class. So we're going to hit routines really heavily in a separate video later. And keep your students motivated. And one of the good things that I really like about teaching bilingual education, as far as language acquisition, is it's pretty hard and fairly artificial to get motivation for elementary and lower secondary students when you're in like a straight English teaching class. But if you're doing content, I mean, that is the motivation. As long as you can be a decent content teacher, you can give the students something that they feel like, oh yeah, I really want to know what's going on here. There's a reason why we're studying this, and I need to understand this language in order to get this content. So we do a lot of things that good classrooms do everywhere, with routine and, you know, having discipline, not over discipline, but enough discipline that everybody feels comfortable, nobody's stressed. We do a lot of scaffolding and stuff like that. Um, and then we, you know, then we have that self-confidence built up, low anxiety. Um, but especially when you hit the middle school years, it's really hard to have students without anxiety. It's pretty much they're big balls of anxiety, and that's why a lot of people don't like doing middle school classes. Honestly, it's really hard to get development from it. But if you're good at it and you nailed that age range, then you got a job in life. Um, so take a look at the effective filter, which comes out of Gratian's uh, hypothesis here. So you know, you can see whatever input you're providing, whether it's written, whether they're reading or whether they're listening. You know, it runs through that filter, and then the stuff that's left over is the things that they can they can use to get for as comprehensible input to get that language acquisition. So we really want to keep that filter open as much as possible. Okay, so Dr. Bilash has a ending point here. The reading hypothesis. I mentioned earlier, listening is really hard. It's really hard to get good acquisition from listening. And if you think about that for a minute, you'll know it's true because everybody has seen videos of little kids singing a song. Often it's a national anthem from whatever their home country is, and just completely screwing up the words because they've never read them, right? They've only heard them, and they've heard whatever they wanted to hear, and they make whatever meaning they want out of it. So, uh, for me, reading is by far the preferred way to drive comprehension. And one of the problems is when students are reading, they really don't know how to pronounce any words. Uh, so, you know, if they hit new words, new vocabulary words, most of the time they won't know how to pronounce them, or it's not clear, or they don't have a good model for the cadence of the language, you know, various intonations and such like that. So I almost always like to provide a listening script to go along with whatever the students are reading, and then they get to both read and listen at the same time. And for me, that is um, by far the most effective way for students to acquire language. I actually last year had a teacher who said seriously, you know, students have never learned to speak a language by reading it. Um, that is patently false. So basically, the best way to get the best way to get language acquisition is through reading, because you have that time. You hit something you don't know. You have the time to go back and reread it, and that's a new, especially grammar forms. You know, new sentence patterns, something like that, an idiom, something like that. You may have to read that 3 or 4 times in context and puzzle over it. And go, oh yeah, I get that. So, so reading is by far the best way to get it. But if you have a choice for your students, definitely combine reading and listening. And we'll have a video on comprehensible output and how to drive output later. But most of what students need to do is they need to be able to understand what's going on in your content classroom, and they get that through reading, and that's other way. Okay, so in addition to comprehensible input, there's a level above that. Hold on, let me get this here. There we go. So our compelling input is even more. and like I said, that I plus one, that one, really varies. And one of the big ways that it varies is through motivation. And motivation for the student wanting to understand, in a lot of cases, the text. They really, really want to know what's going on here. Um, and they the best place that you can be. This is from leonardoenglish.com, by the way. The One of the best places you can be is when your students really forget that they're in a second language. They want to know so much that they're really just focused on that problem and not the you know L1 to L2 difficulties that they're having. Um, so compelling input is super important. A great way for you to help your students. But I want to talk about ways to make input more comprehensible. So over here on the right, we've got visuals. And if you're a standard teacher, you're a classroom teacher, you'll probably run into Persano and high impact teaching strategies, and um, you know, graphic organizers and other non-verbal representations. That falls under stuff for him. So infographics are great. Videos are especially good in this day and age. We have a lot of opportunity to use videos. Don't make them fun, but don't make them too humorous, because then kids, especially age like lower secondary and below, they really get focused more on the comedy than actually what the meaning is. So as far as my teachers, when I'm observing teachers and training teachers, I always tell teachers to slow down, speak clearly. When we're in early classes, we need to basically limit our speech to as much to the area that you guys have already worked through, or things that are so, excuse me, things that are so obvious from context, uh, that kids won't feel frustrated, won't feel stressed about being submersed in a language they don't understand. So when you're in a very, very basic class, you need to pull down the amount of vocabulary you're using. We're using very, very short sentences. As you get into a higher level classes, you can add more, but you still need to be careful about idioms and things like that. There are a lot of idioms that, cross culturally, it may not even make any sense to most people. So there's, you've got Americans and Welshmen trying to talk to each other, and they're using various idioms that neither of them know. They still can't communicate despite them both speaking dialects of English from birth. I guess Welsh maybe not, but you know what I mean. As basically the primary language of communication. So over here on the left, build background, prior learning, global concepts. Always be aware of the prerequisite skills, the prerequisite language that students are going to need to have in whatever class you're in, and make sure that you scaffold up to that point. You provide them work to get them up to that point. Academic tasks. Students need to know how to complete tasks. That may sound simple, but I have a lot of teachers I observe that just don't model correctly, and we're going to get that into that in a second with kind of explicit instruction or direct instruction. But they just don't model it correctly, and the students don't really understand what they need to do. And then you have the 10-minute academic task where students are expected to have some kind of group discussion or produce a graphic organizer, but they really don't understand what they needed to do, and then that's 10 minutes in your class gone. And one of the reasons why I like bilingual education so much is there's so many challenges, and I find it so rewarding if we're good at it, because we generally have half the time, uh, half the school day is devoted to their L1 local language, and then another half, maybe less than half, is devoted to devoted to subjects in English, and so we don't have as much time as we normally would. You know, if I were teaching math in the U.S., I might have 5 periods a week. The last school that I taught math in Asia, I had 3 periods per week to do the same amount of material, and it's in their second language. So you can't afford to lose 10 minutes of class. You can't do it. Every minute of class has to be productive. So I want to go through this blog post from empoweringELLs.com, because I think it pretty much covers what I'm looking for here. Hold on. There we go. Okay. I have to find the window. Not clear to you guys, but I have to find the window to make this work. So, I don't agree with 100% of the stuff in this motorcycle outside. I don't agree with 100% of this stuff, but it's pretty close to what I would train a teacher to do. So, number one thing that we can do to make instruction more comprehensible is do direct instruction. Which, if you're coming from a language learning background, then you probably took a TEFL or a TESOL or a CELTA course, and you learned ESA or PPP, and that's basically what this is. If you are a classroom teacher coming from a classroom teacher background, you learn I do, we do, you do, and that's basically what this is. They're similar, and especially I have taught a good 6 years of upper elementary and middle school science, and it's really intriguing to teach inquiry-based science. But in a lot of cases, your students are not going to get nearly as much from that language-wise as they would if you do a bit more direct instruction and try to alternate or find some days where after you've done enough direct instruction, the students really understand how to have the proper conversations. Then you can move into to inquiry. But I think that's why some teachers, not me, some teachers prefer international because they can do a lot more. But as I said before, I like the challenge of having to build up both skills and language at the same time, while generally having less class time. It's really challenging. So watch me do, or I do, or presentation, joint construction here we do, or controlled practice if you're doing a PPP model here. So the teacher will and even if I'm teaching science, or if I'm teaching reading, for me, I'll still have things like sentence stems, sentence patterns for the students to use, but we give them a little bit of freedom. We're in that gradual release of responsibility model, and we've been giving them a little bit of freedom here. Coached construction. This is where there we go. That's where you do, Okay, so now they do a task which is not necessarily authentic at this point, but doable for them. It's that next step off, uh, and then that's less controlled practice. If we're in a PPP model, we're still in the second P, but that's a less controlled practice. They've got more freedom in their practice. And then the last stage that we're going to go in is here. You do if kids have some kind of authentic task that they need to complete, a task that would look like they really would in whatever subject you're teaching. So, not yet, but a lot of times, my classes that I coach teachers on, the beginning of the class doesn't look very much like a home country subject class, but the goal is by the end of the class, especially by the end of a unit, that is much more in that model. So we're stepping kids up to. Uh, all right, so that's it. The last thing I wanted to talk about is ZPD here, because zone proximal development is similar. I say similar in many ways to comprehensible input. I+1, you know, the model is not that different, and the way that we bring kids up little by little to just that next step that they can do with the intent that they will get to the much higher step that was impossible for them. That kind of thing is similar, and having the skill to make input more comprehensible, to make your class more comprehensible, and to use zone of proximal development. These are all very related skills, but I just want to point out that zone of proximal development is not comprehensible input theory. And the reason is because we're talking about a dedicated part of our brain to, linguistic analysis, language processing. So, whereas for zone of proximal development, we're dealing more with skills. So, do the students have the skills necessary to do X? No. Where are they deficient in these skills, and what skills do I need to teach them in which order? And that's a lot different than trying to take down the complexity or provide context. But big picture, they're very much the same. And if you as a teacher can go into a classroom, and I titled this "The Basics of Bilingual Education." If you as a teacher can go in there and have that model for yourself, where you are able, the skills to take a year's worth of content, figure out what the students need to be doing in each month, in each unit, on a progress in that unit, break it down, figuring out what skills, what language students need to be using in each lesson, and in each lesson how to bring the kids up from where they are now to where they need to be at the end of the lesson. You're going to be a top 5% teacher. Seriously, if you know how to do that, you are going to separate yourselves from the pack, and it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun. So that's the end of my lesson for this one on foundations of good bilingual education. So I'll try to put out another one sometime this week. I've got most of them planned out already. I just have to find reasonable material to talk around. All right, so thanks for listening to me, and I'm Dan, and I'll see you later.